Chomping on Chomsky, my contribution towards the 2020 virtual conference for the Psychology and Sociology gathering at West Suffolk College. The gentleman in the photograph here is indeed Noam Chomsky, now a very elderly man, as you can see. Prolific author, has produced vast reams of books and articles and given innumerable lectures and podcasts and what have you. He initially became famous in the field of psychology, where he developed some significant theories around how people acquire and develop language, both as children in terms of developing their mother tongue, but also as adults learning a second, third, fourth language. His arguments were that language acquisition is rooted in the biological structure of the brain. It's something innate to us. But it's not his language theories that we're going to be looking at today. We're going instead to focus on his ideas around what he initially termed manufacturing consent, which is a phrase he acquired from an earlier theorist called Lippmann, whom we'll come back to as we go along. Chomsky's argument, which he developed in conjunction with Edward Herman, in fact, Chomsky says the majority of the ideas featuring in the book Manufacturing Consent, that was written in 1988, came from Herman himself, and that Chomsky's contribution to the book was a smaller one than Herman's contribution. But in the years since that book hit the shelves in 1988, he's given lectures on the topic, he's revised ideas, published various papers related to his initial, or his and Herman's initial ideas around propaganda and the way propaganda is used to manufacture consent. So even if his initial contribution to the book was a comparatively small one, he's certainly run with the idea to a great extent in the years since. At one juncture, he was labelled the most important intellectual alive today by the New York Times. And he's a fairly humble man, so I don't think he'd go around bragging that himself, but he's certainly made a massive contribution to the intellectual life, not only of America, where he lives, but the world at large. Now, he defines himself as a libertarian socialist, and he's very much on the left wing. In fact, some people might argue he's a lot more left wing than simply a socialist. Those left wing views do significantly affect his ideas around the manufacture of consent and propaganda, but we're not going to contain ourselves to a purely left wing view as we go through this podcast. We'll look at how these ideas can be applied on the right and in the centre of politics, as well as on the left of politics. But it is worth bearing in mind that Chomsky himself is very much on the left, and therefore that has shaped and influenced his ideas. One of the key ideas that he and Herman put forward back in '88 was that propaganda as such exists in a sort of a three-way overlap between three different institutions. One is the government, the state, and being an American himself, Chomsky's interest was in the American state, but you could equally apply these arguments to the government of Britain, the government of Zambia, the government of Australia, the government of anywhere you care to think of. The same ideas would consistently apply across. So one arm of this three-legged beast, if we can put it like that, is the state. The other arm is the world of corporate big business, and we are talking very, very big business. The businesses that make enormous sums of money rather than the little small-scale businesses. But even with the small-scale businesses, you can see elements of this creeping in, and we'll give examples of that as we go along. And finally, the third leg of the beast is mainstream media, which back in '88 was essentially newspapers, TV, and to a lesser extent radio and cinema. These days, we have, of course, social media to add to this, bearing in mind that social media didn't really get going until 1997 with the development of the 6 Degrees platform. So Chomsky has, in the updates on the book, incorporated ideas around social media. And that's something I'd like to get you, the listeners, to think a bit about and take away with you at the end, as to how these ideas apply in the very strange world of the 21st century, which has some significant differences from the world of 1988, when these concepts and theories were first being advanced. So the collusion between state, business, and media is one of mutual back-scratching. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that this is not a straightforward, harmonious relationship, because each of those three branches have their own internal rifts. So within the state, not all politicians, quite obviously, agree with each other. So even within the same party, you'll get feuding, backstabbing, rivalry, competing ideologies, competing policies. Within the world of big business, clearly one big business may be clashing with a rival big business, fighting for the same commercial basis, for the same customers. Within the media, one TV station may clash with another, one newspaper may clash with another. So there's all sorts of competition within. In fact, if you take a broad swathe view, it really starts to feel like something out of Game of Thrones, with all of the internecine politics, backstabbing, rivalry, and various people vying for supremacy. So the overlap between these institutions is not a harmonious one. It is, however, one of mutual support, in that a gain for one can easily become a gain for the other. And certainly a loss for one equally can become a loss for the other. So there is this sort of need to prop each other up. At least that is Chomsky's argument, that they're all propping each other up fundamentally. And the way they prop each other up is through the dissemination of propaganda. Now, the idea is by no means unique to either Herman or Chomsky. In fact, we can go back to people like Antonio Gramsci. Quite a stretch of time earlier, Gramsci advanced the notion of what he termed cultural hegemony. That is to say, cultures survive, and he was talking about the Italian culture, but you could apply this to any other culture you care to think of. Cultures survive by immersing their citizens in certain ideas and concepts and notions, which are disseminated through the arts, through the media, through all sorts of branches, politics, religion, the list goes on, and so immerses the public in certain ways of thinking that, rather like a fish in water, most of us become oblivious to the culture around us. We forget there are alternative ways of seeing the world. And it just feels as if our way of seeing the world is the most natural, the most automatic one. People must always have thought like this in the past, and they must always continue to think like this in the future. It doesn't occur to most of us that there are alternatives. Gramsci says this is how people at the top of culture stay in power, essentially by convincing those beneath them that the power hierarchies, and Gramsci was heavily influenced by Marx and the arguments around conflict theory and the internecine struggles between the very rich and the very poor. And so this permeates all those ideas, and from Gramsci permeates into Chomsky's arguments and ideas, that what we essentially have is a tiny elite. Many of you will be familiar with the idea of all the 1% and the 99%, which is a sort of a rallying cry for a lot of protest movements in recent years, of suggesting that there is this 1% elite at the top of society, and then there's everyone else. If we're being realistic, it probably isn't even 1%, it's probably less than that. The number of incredibly rich, phenomenally rich people out there who own the mass media, who practically own politicians and political parties by exercising their enormous wealth and influence, who own many, many corporations and businesses. Chomsky is arguing that that tiny, minuscule number of people keep themselves in power by putting out propaganda. But it's not propaganda in the sense that that word was used back in the Second World War, or indeed the First World War, of posters on walls and so on. That very in-your-face type of propaganda is the sort of unsubtle end of the propaganda market. What Chomsky is talking about here is the much more subtle end of the market, where you don't even, as the consumer, you don't even notice that it is propaganda anymore. Much like Gramsci's argument that you don't notice that your cultural indoctrination is indoctrination, because it's done so subtly, so pervasively, so all-encompassingly, that most of us don't really think that there is any other way of being except the one we've been taught about. Now, when it comes to understanding how propaganda works, and this is the subtle form of propaganda, not the sledgehammer form of propaganda, Herman and Chomsky argue that our understanding of the world, which is a combination of news from the TV and newspapers and so on, and entertainment, TV shows, films, sports matches, all of that sort of thing, which are not news per se, but which convey information about the nature of the world, the nature of society to us, the consumer of the films and the TV shows and the radio programs and the rest of it. That passes through 5 filters of ownership, of advertising, of sources, of flack, and of what these days is usually referred to as ideology, although in the 1988 version it was referred to in a different way, but we'll get onto that as we go along. So what are these filters? We'll go over each one in turn. We'll start with the ownership one. Many of you hopefully will recognize the chap in the photograph as Rupert Murdoch, who owns the Sun newspaper and vast numbers of other media outlets all over the world. He is one of the richest people and undoubtedly one of the most powerful people on the planet. Chomsky begs the question of who owns the media. Now, back in 88, you could have said who owns the newspapers? Who are the big newspaper magnates in America? Now, whilst Chomsky's work is focused heavily on America, we'll try and think of this more from a British perspective, because I'm assuming virtually everyone listening to this is going to be somebody who lives in Britain. Whether or not you were born here, you now live here. And so the British experience would be more familiar to you. But if any of you have had time living in other countries, you might be able to relate this to the media of those countries that you've previously lived in. Once you know who owns the media, Chomsky says you can then sit down and think about their agendas. What's their political slant? Are they very right-wing, very left-wing, very in the centre? Do they support particular single-issue causes? Maybe one person is very pro-life and another person is very pro-choice. One person could be very concerned about environmental issues and another person might think the whole climate change issue is a hoax. You could get all sorts of different strong opinions going in different directions on various different issues. Once you know what the driving passions are of the people who own the media, you can start to see how they are utilizing the media that they own in order to convey their ideas, their passions, their causes to the people who read their papers or watch their TV programs or listen to their radio stations, whatever it may be. And the way in which those ideas are spread subtly so that they will be conveyed to the media consumers in such a way as half the time they don't even realize the message that's being put across to them. It will become like a second nature, like the fish in water, barely aware of the water itself, because it's just there all of the time. And so it starts to influence the consumer in that particular way. Now, these are current day media owners. I don't know how long this particular podcast will be in circulation, so perhaps if it's still being listened to in a few years' time, this will have changed. And there may be new papers or new owners or what have you. But this is the case for the moment. And we won't go over all of these because you can read it for yourself. But some of these names would undoubtedly be very familiar to most listeners, like Rupert Murdoch and Lord Rothermere, Richard Desmond. Other names might be less familiar, like Nikkei Incorporated or the Scott Trust Limited. These are individuals and corporations that own large chunks of national British newspapers. Now, I've not included on this list local newspapers, things like the East Anglian Daily Times or the Bury Free Press and things like that. They in turn will have their owners. And again, you could look at who owns those kind of local papers in various different parts of the country. There must be hundreds and hundreds of localized newspapers, which will not, which will also have their own agendas. So just as these big national papers have their agendas, so the little local ones do as well. The agendas set by the owners of these papers. Now, one of the excuse me, one of the key arguments that Chomsky makes is that a driving bedrock common to all of these people, so no matter whether they're left-wing, right-wing, centrist, what they are in terms of their politics, the one thing that Murdoch and Rothermere and Desmond and Lebedev and all of the others have in common is the wish to make money. They need to sell their newspapers. And that becomes a critical issue here. And it's something which could be spoken about at great length and would require more than this 45-minute podcast to address. It's an ongoing debate in sociology, in media studies, in a number of related areas as to who leads who. And if you want to think of the public as rather like a cow in a field, or a bull in a field, as the case may be, and the media is the farmer. The farmer wants to get milk out of the cow, or utilize the bull in other ways, if we're going for the bull motif. And so there's a relationship between the farmer and the bovine. Who is leading who? Does the farmer take the cow down to the river for it to drink? I know that's more commonly used as a horse analogy than the cow one, but never mind. Or does the farmer get led by the cow where the cow wants to go? Put this in terms of newspapers. If I go out and buy a newspaper, the ultimate owner of that newspaper is deciding what news I will read, what opinion pieces I will read. Am I being brainwashed, told what to think by the person who owns the media? So in other words, am I like a docile cow in a field being led down to the river to drink and do as I'm told? Or am I a bit more of a stroppy bovine who pulls and tugs and wanders off in different directions, and the farmer has to chase after me to keep up with me? So if I don't like what this newspaper tells me, I just won't buy it again. I'll go and buy somebody else's newspaper. And so the media barons are chasing me. They are wanting to win me over to get the money out of my wallet to buy their newspaper and to convince me to keep reading. So if I want a newspaper that has more information about sports, then if that newspaper owner wants to keep my interest, they've got to put more sports information. If I want a newspaper that's more right-wing or more left-wing, then if the magnate is to keep my custom, they will have to go with what I want. Otherwise, I'm going to wander off and buy a different paper. So there's this ongoing debate about whether the public leads the media or whether the media leads the public. Chomsky, through his focus on ownership, is more concerned about the extent to which the media leads the public, fundamentally, and perhaps it settles around an argument that's sometimes referred to as agenda setting, that even if the media can't wholly brainwash the public and force you to think precisely what they want you to think, they can nonetheless set the agenda about the issues you think about. If I have no idea that a murder has taken place, I can't have an opinion on it. It's only if I'm told by the newspapers or the TV or whatever media I consume that a murder has taken place. Only then can I have an opinion on it. Now, whether the paper is presenting a left-wing, right-wing, whatever else view of the murder, I may agree or disagree with the slant they're taking, but I'm dependent on them for the provision of the information in the first place. Or at least I was, until social media happened. And this is one of the challenges to the propaganda model as to how it incorporates the bizarre new world of social media. And whilst there would undoubtedly be people listening to this who were born after 1997, for whom there's never been anything other than social media for the entirety of their lives. For those of us of a certain age who can remember the world before social media, it's been a hell of a big change. And when we're living in a period of change, it feels as if the world will always be the way it is during the change. There was a world before social media. There might well be a world after social media. How long will it last? Who can say? The people you've got listed here are the enormously wealthy owners of the various types of social media outlet listed there. There are significant differences. If I'm reading a newspaper, it tells me what's going on in the world, and it gives me opinion pieces and slants on what is going on in the world. It may say, well, the Prime Minister said so-and-so today, and the newspaper will either support the Prime Minister or tear the Prime Minister apart, depending on the politics of the paper. That's been the traditional mode of consuming media. I can now log on to Facebook or to Google or to Twitter or one of these things and find out information that's not only put up there by the employees of Google and so forth, but it's all stuff that's put up there by friends, family, neighbours, people I vaguely know in some context. It's referred to increasingly as citizen journalism, the way in which we can report on events happening in the world around us and give our slant to those events. What we agree with, what we disagree with, what we like, what we don't like. So we're no longer as reliant on journalists, be they newspaper journalists, TV journalists, or what have you, as we used to be a few decades ago. We are increasingly taking on this role for ourselves, or at least we think we are. However, I would suggest, if you just take Facebook, for an example, which is the biggest in terms of the sheer volume of people who subscribe to these different services, how many people, when they are putting information on Facebook or arguably other forms of social media, are putting their own view versus how many people are copying a meme which somebody somewhere created for them? And is this endless repetition of other people's memes simply like showing a friend a newspaper? In other words, someone, maybe a paid someone, could be a paid journalist, a paid social media commentator, could be an independent individual who's not being paid, but somebody somewhere has created what is essentially an opinion piece. And people on social media just repeat it and repeat it and repeat it, effectively agreeing with it by the very act of copying and pasting and repeating the thing, circulating it again and again and again, but it's not their point of view. When social media first started, it was lauded as this fantastic way for Joe Public to get their individual opinions out there. To a point, that has happened, but also arguably what we're seeing is an increasing tendency to rely on some external person for their opinion, for their slant, for their take, their politics, their edited view of what is going on in the world. So you can take examples at the moment of recent protests, whether it's for Black Lives Matters or whether it's for people standing around statues trying to prevent them from being torn down, whichever direction you want to go in. There are some people putting up video clips of very peaceful demonstrations, very respectable demonstrations, people behaving themselves very politely, and there are other people putting up video clips of bottles being thrown and people punching police officers or lobbing bricks at police horses or what have you. Both of these events are happening. There are instances that are violent, there are instances that are peaceful. What we get on social media, exactly the same as we get on the TV broadcasts and in photographs in newspapers, is a selected view of what is going on. Someone makes a decision, I will only show the violent stuff or I will only show the peaceful stuff, because it's serving their politics, it's serving their agenda to show what they want to show. In this sense, is social media actually functioning any differently from traditional forms of media? in as much as it's presenting a very edited view of the world. It's just a different person doing the editing. Something to think about. Moving on to the second filter and the power of advertising, we return to Chomsky's argument that the driving motivation behind media ownership, and that doesn't matter whether we're talking newspapers, TV stations, social media, or anything else, is the wish to make money. There are other motivations, the wish for power, for political influence, etc., but primarily money is the bedrock. The chasing of profits. Newspapers and TV stations, well, it's not the BBC, but the commercial ones, make an enormous profit from selling advertising revenue. Newspapers tend to make more money from the advertising than they do from selling the actual copies of newspapers. And therefore, advertisers acquire huge clout over the media. And so this filter is the filter of the clout exercised by companies and corporations who want to buy advertising space, whether in a newspaper, on TV, on Facebook, Twitter, whatever else, other methods that people might want to exert their capacity to advertise their product. And so at one level, it's basic things. Toy companies will want to buy up space in what you might term the children's hour, that period of the day when children's TV programs tend to be on, because they know the kids, well, kids aren't the one buying it, but they're the ones demanding the toys of their parents. So you convince the kids to want the toys first, and the parents will be opening their wallets and purses accordingly. That's at a basic level. But there's also the sense in which if a TV station or a newspaper starts to promote issues that seem against the interests of an advertiser, they are in effect biting the hand that feeds them. So to give you a very simple example, let's say a car manufacturer wants to buy up advertising space in a newspaper to promote their latest type of car, but that type of car has been involved in a number of collisions because there's some fault with it. Now, if the newspaper runs an article saying, so-and-so type of car involved in 15 crashes this week, questions to be asked, is the advertiser going to want to buy advertising space with that newspaper? No, they're not, because that newspaper is damaging their sales. And so the editor will know that if he or she runs this article, their revenue in terms of selling advertising space to the car company will drop. And so will they make a decision to either drastically water down what the article says or simply not publish it in the first place? And it's not necessarily that the car manufacturer has to, the owner, the CEO of the car company has to storm around the newspaper offices, puffing a big cigar, banging the table, and saying how very dare you run these articles. You don't need to do that. It will simply be understood in the nature of business that you do not bite the hand that feeds you. Otherwise, you're going to lose money. And so it starts to shape, and this is Chomsky's point, what news, what information, what things will you find out about in the world? Well, you're not likely to find out anything that runs against the best interests of the advertisers who subsidize the type of media you're consuming. There are other angles to take into account. These days, vast numbers of films, TV shows, and so on, works of fiction, have very lucrative merchandising associated with them. You can buy your Doctor Who cup or your Games of Thrones t-shirt or whatever the thing may be. A ton of money can be made through the popularity of works of fiction. A lot of YouTubers and people like that also have their t-shirts with logos on, things that they sell. They get involved in merchandising and there's a commercial arm to support themselves. And once again, is someone going to go against their own financial interests if it means losing merchandising? So let's say a show introduces a new character and they have their little plastic toys of the characters in the show, and that particular character is, for whatever reason, unpopular and doesn't sell many toys. Are the merchandisers who've shelled out a lot of money to make these plastic toys and have the logos on them going to turn around to the TV show and say, look, that character, so-and-so, is rubbish, that we're selling up hardly any toys for them, get rid of them and put in a more popular character. And so the way the show runs is then adjusted to take into account successful merchandising lines. And it's not just business that pays to advertise. Political parties expend enormous sums of money on advertising, particularly at election times. Again, will a newspaper or TV station bite the hand that feeds when it comes to politicians? Celebrities have a mutually back-scratching relationship with the media. On the one hand, they want to promote their films, their TV shows, and what have you. On the other hand, there's always the temptation for a bit of celebrity gossip. Who's sleeping with who's got a drug addiction, who's booked into a clinic for an eating disorder or whatever it might be. The type of scandal that sells newspapers and TV shows by the crate load. Will a celebrity give an interview for their upcoming film with a particular newspaper or a particular TV program if that program has done a hatchet job on their reputation previously? Again, probably not. And so there develops a relationship between the famous and the sources of media as to how far the sources of media can go in exposing stories if they know they might suffer a backlash later on. Religions, to some extent, engage in advertising, not quite the same way that political parties do. But again, there is a sort of a mutual benefit between the public image of a religion as purveyed by the media and their willingness to engage with the media. We could, if we had the time, pause and explore the extent to which there has been a shift, a noticeable shift in the entertainment industry. Once upon a time, TV programs were chiefly there to entertain. To a greater and greater extent, we could argue that TV programs, both commercial and non-commercial in terms of the BBC, are taking on board the role of social engineering, of trying to change how their viewers think. Now, that may be in terms of gender issues. What kind of roles can be performed by men? What kind of roles can be performed by women? It may be in terms of social issues, trying to get, say, gay people or transgender people or whatever particular section of the population to be more accepted and more visible than they were previously. It can be more in terms of lifestyle issues. So take Love Island rather. Go back a few decades, that kind of show would never have appeared on television. Because at one point, the idea of having a show in which everyone was sleeping around and it was all very free and easy and lots of virtually naked people were walking around would simply not have happened. It would not have been considered culturally acceptable, whereas nowadays it's very commercially viable to have exactly that. So not only do you have the issues of suggesting a certain style of relationship, of promiscuity perhaps, and so on, is more acceptable now than it used to be. But also you could think of this in terms of body image. If people are, youngsters particularly, may be more impressionable, constantly looking at super muscled six-pack men or super skinny women, does this start to influence their body image as to what they think they ought to look like, how they think they ought to be behaving in order to be successful and popular and all the rest of it? So there's all these sorts of factors, some ostensibly positive and some ostensibly negative, that seem to shape the views and attitudes of the viewers. Again, we come back to this image of the cow in the field who leads who. Is RuPaul's Drag Race on TV because more people are tolerant of the LGBT community and want to watch the program and enjoy watching it, or by putting it on television in the first place, does that push viewers to become more tolerant than they were previously? Or indeed, does it backfire? Is there a perception, because obviously it's a rather comical show, so do people then see the LGBT community as comical rather than just ordinary everyday people, no more funny, no less funny than anyone else? So again, there is what may seem like a positive move can sometimes backfire and become a form of caricature that puts out a rather odd view of what people are like. Does Love Island put out a very odd view of what youngsters are like? So for those of us of certain generations, do we sit there assuming that all young people have these wild, somewhat orgiastic lifestyles, when in fact probably a lot of them don't? So does it put out a kind of a misconception about what other sections of the population are like? How does it change our views, change our attitudes, change our ideas? And this becomes maybe more of an ethical issue than a sociological one, but is it the job of TV and newspapers and media to tell us what we ought to be thinking about certain social issues, or should they rather simply report on what people do actually think? Can it give a very skewed impression? If they are there engineering, whose interests are they socially engineering the population towards? Because ultimately, Chomsky would argue that the media are not there to be saints, they're not there to be humanitarians and philanthropists making the world a better place. They're there to make money. They're there to extend the clout and influence of the owners of mass media. They're not cuddly, fluffy bunnies trying to make the world a better place, necessarily. That may be him being overly jaded, but it's worth bearing in mind. The source of news, the next filter to think about, is the relationship the media has to those outlets that provide them with information in the first place. Very obvious one there is the political outlet. Governments have their official spokespeople who deliver information to the media about what's happening in the world, or at least in the country, if not the world at large. And journalists will trot up to receive the latest batch of information. As we can see from some of the clashes that go on in America of late, if there is a falling out between a particular news outlet, a particular newspaper or TV station, whatever it is, and the government in question, then it creates for a rather tense relationship, a rather difficult, challenging relationship, where, again, how far can a particular media source continue to bite the hand that feeds it? And it's not just politicians, religions, particularly the big religions, have their own PR branches that disseminate information. The Vatican does, the Church of England does, all sorts of other religious institutions have their own arms that mediate information out to the press. Likewise, we could think about celebrities with their agents, how information is conveyed about them to the press, and so on. So where is the media getting their sources from, their information from, and what is the nature of the relationship between them? Flack is something that Chomsky argues comes from the top down. Other people have questioned this and pointed out that it can also come from the bottom up, but we'll get to that in a second. Where it's top down, Chomsky argues that the enormously rich and powerful use their wealth, their money and clout to pressurize media outlets that start saying things which they don't like, which seem to go against the message they want to put out across to the public and have the public widely accept. And sometimes that pressure can become so intense that the media in question, which could be a particular TV station, a particular newspaper, will buckle under and fit in with what the person applying the flack wants in the first place. You can see elements of this, and it's something that Chomsky picks up on with some of his talks and his papers and so forth, where he picks out particular headlines of how the same thing can be understood in very different ways, and the language used totally changes the impression made upon the consumers of media. You've got a couple of examples there. So if people go protesting about climate change, for example, are they environmentalists very worried about the future and animals and plant life and so forth, or are they eco-terrorists? And it can be exactly the same bunch of people behaving, and again, going back to what we were saying earlier, depending on how selective you want to be about the photographs or the video clips that you use, that if a large number of people are engaged in a particular event, some of them will behave in this way and others will behave in a different way. And journalists can be very selective about what photos they use, what headlines they use to convey a particular impression. And it doesn't mean that only one of these views is correct and the other one is false, because to some extent they're both very selective, which is something worth bearing in mind. The slight counter-argument to Chomsky is that it's not only the enormously rich and powerful who exert pressure and give flack to the media when the media are saying things they don't want to hear. There are a ton of pressure groups, charities, political groups, individual campaigners who utilize social media and petitions and one thing and another if they feel that the media is misrepresenting them in a certain way, or simply putting out information ideas that they do not approve of. So, for example, going back a few decades, there was a lady called Mary Whitehouse who was very concerned and led a campaign protesting against the amount of sex and nudity and swearing and violence on the television. So it wasn't about the misrepresentation of her as a person, but her worry about the impact viewing too much sex and too much violence and hearing too much swearing would have on particularly very young viewers. And you get all sorts of other pressure campaigns coming from not just the rich, coming from all sorts of directions. Chomsky might counter this perhaps by saying that the pressure applied from fairly poor groups and small sectors of society is unlikely to make much difference to the interests of the mass media, whereas pressure coming from the very wealthy, the very powerful, is much more likely to succeed. And therefore, if you see a campaign going on that appears to work, Chomsky might well say, ask yourself, is it really ordinary people succeeding in this? Or is there an awful lot of money somewhere behind the scenes which is succeeding in changing the way the media behave? The ideological filter is the last one we'll talk about. Initially, Chomsky back in '88 referred to this as anti-communism or anti-socialism, because again, he being very much on the left wing, felt that the American media was very much on the right wing and was giving very selective, very hostile portrayals of Russia, of China, of Cuba, or Venezuela, or various left-wing countries, and engaging in a very kind of negative propaganda war against both countries and individuals who are on the left. And certainly if we go as far back as Senator McCarthy and the McCarthyite trials, it becomes very extremely pronounced, the hostile campaign against the left. What we could counter with now is the question of whether this is still always the case, or increasingly with social media and the questions being raised about various governments funding social media campaigns in other parts of the world to influence how votes go and how people view and how people think in other countries. Is this always simply a black and white case of right-wing media versus left-wing countries, or do we have also the other way around? Maybe very, very left-wing media, social media as well as mainstream media, campaigning against more centrist or more right-wing groups, governments, ideologies, etc., or against capitalism itself. So is the war now going in all sorts of different directions rather than only one? One of the elements drawn out by Chomsky and various others like Stanley Cohen is that the threats the media present to the public can come in three categories. There are those threats that are wildly exaggerated, where there is maybe a small risk from a particular group, but by the time the media have done talking about it, it sounds like a massive risk. There are completely imaginary threats, where whoever it is that's being portrayed as a threat is not actually a threat to anyone whatsoever. So the entire thing is a pack of lies. And then there are the realistic threats, where yes, this issue, it's not necessarily always people, but this issue is something the public generally ought to be aware of. And it might be worth adding a fourth category to this to point out that sometimes there are threats to public safety which are never mentioned at all, which are just swept under the carpet and kept hidden by the media. And that's something to think about. So Stanley Cohen said that there are uses to whipping up moral panics. Cohen's work goes back to the 70s, although he wrote various things after that. So very much newspapers, TV stations, radio stations. Modern day commentators like the sociologist Frank Furedi have pointed out that with the advent of social media, the power of moral panics in the hands of traditional media has weakened, and also he argues that multiculturalism has weakened it. If you have a homogenous society where the vast majority of people think pretty much similar things and have pretty much similar values, it's very easy to whip them all up into fear. When you've got a very multicultural society with lots and lots of values, lots and lots of ideas, lots and lots of way of thinking, you can whip up small sections of society into a panic, but it's very difficult to whip everyone up into a panic because you've got so many conflicting values and ideas. Except, he says, when it comes to issues of health, because health is a sort of a unifying factor across all sorts of different demographic groups, and that health panics, Furedi says, are the new version of moral panics. What's the point of a moral panic? Well, Cohen says, picking up on arguments from Emil Durkheim, that they're quite useful for unifying people. If we've all got a common enemy, then we put aside our individual differences and come together to fight a common enemy. Now, that common enemy, it could be some sinister foreign country that's threatening to invade us, or it could be something like a virus that we all have to unify against, or the threat of the ecological disaster that we all have to unify against. So the idea of an enemy isn't necessarily always a particular person or a particular group of people. It can be other things too. On the slightly more jaded side of the argument, there is also the notion that a moral panic, a worry about some terrible threat to us, is quite useful as a diversionary tactic. It's a bit like the stage magician who gets you to look at what they're doing with their right hand so that you don't notice what they're doing with their left hand, which is where the trick is taking place. A government, a newspaper, an institution, a sector of society can point the finger in one direction so that everyone looks over there and nobody notices what's going on in the opposite direction, which is what the institution in question don't want you to notice. So there's all sorts of ways of understanding the nature of fear, the nature of worry, the nature of newspapers and the media in general, carping on about particular groups that you ought to be worried about. You must be worried about this, you must be worried about that. A lot of newspapers, a lot of social media, a lot of TV stations and so forth do make an awful lot of mileage out of worry and fear. And sometimes it changes. This week we're all meant to be afraid of this thing, and next week we're all meant to be afraid of some other thing. But the consistent theme is keeping people worried. And there's always this argument that a worried population is an easily manipulable population. Going back to 1922, Walter Lippmann coined this term manufacturing consent and suggested that the media tries to get people, the majority of their consumers, on side with particular causes, because if most people think in a certain way, it provides tacit consent for things like government policies that go in that direction, or if the government is seen as against the interests and maybe an opposition party is the newest flavour of the day, it can totally change the political landscape by bringing in a more favoured party. There are also commercial elements to this, so that a new product, a new form of technology could be swept in because we're convinced, rightly or wrongly, that most people like this new technology. Everyone else likes it, you should like it too. And so we get on board with the bandwagon. Advertising has worked that way for a very long time. by convincing us that way more people use a product than in reality do, because we then want to be part of the herd. It can also work in a positive way. This may seem all relentlessly negative, but it can help to benefit certain groups who have traditionally been in a very difficult situation in society. So changing people's views on issues of civil rights or same-sex marriage, or women working in certain jobs that in years previous they weren't allowed to work in, all sorts of issues can be brought in if we are convinced most people approve of this thing, therefore it ought to become into reality. Now, whether most people actually do approve of that thing is sometimes very, very difficult to work out. And the media just says, oh, well, where a survey was conducted, 80% of people said this. They don't often tell you that the survey conducted was only of 200 people anyway. 80% sounds very convincing. Being told what the actual numbers are may be a lot less convincing. There's a whole ream of discussion to be had on why some forms of manufactured consent work and why other attempts to create consent fall flat on their face. It doesn't always work. Sometimes media fails in the attempt to manufacture consent, but that's maybe a topic of discussion for a different day. Just to leave you with a couple of issues to think about, I'm not going to give you the answer to this, mostly because I don't know what the answers are. We've circumnavigated a few times around the issue of social media and how this has massively changed, or appears at least to have massively changed, our understanding of how media influence works from the days of traditional media to the days of social media. How is social media used to manufacture consent, to convince people to think in a certain way, to convince them to buy certain products because some social media influencer has endorsed those products? How does the sort of commercial element play into it? And going back to that slide where I showed you the names of various billionaires who had founded social media platforms, how is ownership a factor? Because clearly Mark Zuckerberg's influence over social media, over Facebook, isn't quite the same as Rupert Murdoch's influence over the Sun newspaper. It's in a different context. But how do we understand the influence of the owner and the politics and the agendas and the outlooks of the owners of social media platforms over the kinds of conversations and information that take place on those platforms? Something to reflect on and consider. But that brings us to the end. Thank you for listening. Thank you for taking part in the conference. And there will be other talks, both recorded talks and once the virus is over and done with, and we can go back to normal, there will be regular real-world seminars and workshops open to members of the public to attend at West Suffolk College in the future. Thank you.